The mic is hot and the game is on. You're listening to News for the Nation podcast by Aces Nation, where we talk about
nutrition,
sports performance,
the journey of a student athlete,
and more.
I'm Claire.
I'm Zack. Time to level up. Welcome back, sports fans. We are talking about intermittent power sports today, and we're going to define that really quickly for you. The sports that we're going to be talking about in general, all field sports like soccer, field hockey, lacrosse, and rugby. Let's not waste any time. Let's get right into it.
Yeah.
So just kind of start giving my notes and suggestions, guidelines, considerations, things like that for these intermittent power sports from a strength and conditioning standpoint. First, I think as a professional or just maybe as an athlete or as a spectator, you should note what the needs are of that sport, right? Take notice of the entire thing in general. How does it work? Like, what is important for that sport? Like, what do they need? What do those athletes need to be successful or to play at a high level within the rules of the game, within the field dimensions as well? So first thing, intermittent power sports, wow, you're going to need anaerobic capacity, 100%. It's kind of like the name of the game here with what we're doing. But that being said, you're also going to need some type of aerobic base so you can recover quickly between these bouts of high speed, which is, name of the game again. Also, high strength level, that's going to come with things that you're doing. It also plays into the force that you produce overall, right? And can play into how your muscles contract. Power, meaning rate of force development. So now not only how much force are you producing via strength, how quickly are you producing that force now, right? So we want everything to happen quickly, right? And the last one, hypertrophy. This would probably be more appropriate. It's appropriate for everyone, but more so it's important for contact sports, men's lacrosse in general. Rugby, yeah. So any of these contact sports where you're going to need a little more mass to not get moved or to move someone else, right?
Yeah.
So going off of that, going into training considerations for all those things that we talked about, just bring up the highlights of everything that I think when I am considering needs for the sport and how we would train those things. Energy system development has to be appropriate for the sport. So you want to work in a time frame that's relevant for them. Like I would suggest, I'm going to talk about this later in testing again, but I wouldn't suggest doing a 5K for soccer or having your kids run 3 miles or miles continuously, even though coaches do it all over the place. I know other sports that are in a less aerobic arena than these sports are in general. They do stuff like this all the time, but I wouldn't suggest doing that for your athletes. I mean, I talked last week about the 3-level test, right? That was
for endurance athletes.
That was an interval for endurance athlete, right? So obviously I'm advocating for a test that is, or a conditioning plan program that's not so long and doesn't add wear and tear to what you're already doing, right? So I don't think it's appropriate to do these long runs for these intermittent power sports. So I think to really consider the timeframes that you're working in and how to take advantage of that. Look into research that's out there for those tests, but I myself have also looked for research, couldn't find it, and talked with coaches, talked with like sports coaches, talked with my supervisor, like strength and conditioning professionals of how to develop something that might be a little more appropriate for that sports energy system. So being creative is not a bad thing as long as you're staying within the scientific principles of what you're doing. Okay.
Right. Well, you see a lot of those, not even just testing, but a lot of that like aerobic stuff for like punishment too. In those sports.
Like who? Okay, like I don't understand that either. This is kind of jumping
on a tangent.
This is kind of jumping on a tangent here, but I don't agree with that either. You know, I always think if I was a head coach, I'd probably get fired really quickly because I know that the athlete, what they really want to do is play competitive minutes. So if there was some type of quote unquote, I'm not even going to call it what you said. If there was some type of accountability measure happening, my go-to would always be, okay, you're not playing. And I would be, and I would just continue to coach my butt off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't care if we lost the game because I did everything I could, and you didn't do your job, but I did my job.
Yeah.
Right. So
I agree.
I just always don't get that. Like, hey, you didn't do something that was like within the team rules and stuff, which there should be some accountability
right
within that. Right. But like, hey, I'm going to go
right.
make you do stuff that's going to like, some physical thing that's going to make your performance potentially worse.
Right. Or like you did bad in this drill, or you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing in practice. So just go run a couple laps or go run a mile. This is not going to help. It's probably going to make it worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that doesn't take, I don't know, that doesn't necessarily reinforce what I think coaches always want to reinforce. Right. So,
anyway. That just popped into my mind when you mentioned that.
That was good. That was good. So next type of training consideration here, lower body strength emphasis. I talked about this with the amount of force that you can produce, but strength is highly important for a lot of these crucial movements in sport, whether that be slowing down, speeding up, jumping, if there's any type of movement like that. But also strength is important, putting force into the ground for if you're throwing an implement or throwing a ball via a stick or with your own hands.
Yeah.
So that's important there. Rate of force development, we talked about being important. You want to be able to produce force quickly. We're talking about, get your foot into the ground, create force quickly, or you're slowing down. You want to be able to go into that eccentric movement as fast as possible and safely as possible with a good range of motion there as well. Not being outside your center of gravity. That's a high point as well. But things that you could do for training that, you could do Olympic weightlifting derivatives, I would say is really appropriate for the age group within middle school to high school. Plyometrics, always a great go-to. I mean, even more so, I think, than Olympic weightlifting derivatives at the young age, like get people to produce force like against gravity at a high rate.
Maybe clarify what you mean by Olympic lifting derivatives.
Okay. So personally, from experience at the collegiate level, I wouldn't do a full clean, like a catch on a clean.
Like the turnover part.
Right. Because there's so much variance in how people do it. And if you're teaching a kid like very early on, there's also going to be a big learning curve. Like if you're going to have this person for 8 years or so, you're probably okay to like start training them with the very simple like PVC pipe, dowel rod type of movements and whatever. But if you only have them for a certain period of time, I wouldn't do it. Like when kids come in the collegiate realm, we got a transfer that comes in. He's going to be with me for 2 years. He's never done cleaning in his life. Like, why am I going to waste my time on that?
Right.
I'm going to see this kid for a certain amount of weeks before they like go heavy into competition or something. And then like they're going to be on several holiday breaks, and then he's going to go away for the summertime, and who knows if he comes back to the school or not, So I just think it's not necessarily great. So for like clean, I would stick with a pull, right? But however, let me say that good preface here for any of these Olympic weightlifting movements, you have to be able to do certain things first. Like you have to be able to deadlift first. So to teach that is important. That puts another emphasis on strength if you're trying to get there. But also that's just the high level of force that you have to develop to move a bar that's not moving. Talked in an earlier, like a couple podcasts ago about Newton's, 3 laws and how that plays into deadlift. So that's one of your main things. You have to establish good movements in strength before you start doing Olympic weightlifting movements, right? Like you have to have mobility, you have to have the requisite strength to do those things. So if you're going to do them, you better have had the foundation first.
Right.
But again, I would do like a high pull or something like that. My opinion, the snatch is a little easier to teach. So you could probably get away with trying to teach it through a dowel rod. And then as they build up strength, you can probably start to teach it with an empty barbell.
Like a lightweight, yeah.
Yeah, or a training barbell that's a little bit lighter. However, that also takes time out of your training day to teach those things.
Right.
So you really have to make sure that's a staple of your program before you start saying, I'm going to teach this because I want my kids to do snatch, and that's going to look good to like parents and other teams, and when I put it on social media.
Yeah. Is there something else you could do that has the same stimulus that's going to get you the same results, maybe even quicker with less effort?
Right. I mean, that's for the middle school, high school age group. Like I think working on strength and developing a reduction in ground contact time on plyometrics is where it's at, I think. I think you should stick with those. But however, I'm just listing out considerations. So there's a good question, Claire.
Thanks for clarifying.
You bet. So after any of those Olympic weightlifting derivatives or plyometric considerations, also you should work on sprinting as well. You want to be able to turn over pretty quickly, whether that's at acceleration or full speed. Talking about sprinting, you're going to need to work on speed, right? And in the considerations of both those sports, you're going to need to work somewhere between 5-yard speed, right, and acceleration to 60-yard top end speed, right. I mean, it's huge range, but I mean, these sports that we're talking about cover large ranges of field at a time. So it's important to have top end speed and great pure acceleration as well. Eccentric rate of force development. It's really crucial when reacting to a player, to the ball, making a move on the field that's not determined by you. It's great for rapid change of direction. So to be able to slow yourself down and be in a position where you can make multiple movements takes a lot of strength, right? And it takes the ability to create force quickly to be able to propel yourself in a different direction after you've made that decision. So eccentric rate of force development is important as well. Talked about rapid change of direction. Boom, went into the next thing. Change of direction and agility. So what I mean by the two of them here, change of direction being planned, agility being unplanned, or you're reacting to something. So it's important to have change of direction foundations first. You need to be able to put yourself in a position to react in whatever direction you want to, or you may need to on the field. Right. So you have to have good mechanics for that. Are you slowing down efficiently? Is your center of gravity in the right spot? Are you, is your weight on your foot, is that in a good placement for you to be able to make a move somewhere, right? What is your base with your feet? You want to, in essence, when you have to make a decision quickly and you're reacting, you want to be able to be in a good spot where I don't have to take any more steps would be optimal. But if I can take the fewest amount of steps to give myself the chance to catch up with or beat that person, that's what you want. Right. I'll say this about one thing. A lot of people kind of get caught up on, when you're in a bilateral stance or you're in an athletic position, I'll say. Wow, for the viewers, athletic you get
stance.
to see, for the viewers on YouTube, you get to actually see my hands while I'm demonstrating this as a feat. So, when you're in that stance, and some people call it a false step, where you step back. Yeah. Some research suggests that's called a plyo step, where you're actually building kinetic energy by taking that step and allowing yourself to burst out. So I can't remember the research paper that was out there. So go look that up. But there is good evidence that a plyo step is not as bad as people make a false step seem. So, I mean, that's always something to think. And also, you can teach people to do certain things, right? Like you get these learned behaviors and patterns. But if that person's already fast in that plyo step, now you're trying to have them think more and adjust more to take your not false step. So in essence, you could be making them slower because they're having to think more.
Yeah. You want to think of just muscle memory and going.
Yeah. You want to think less when you're having to react, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's that free information. Next on training considerations, proper dynamic warm-up, right? This is huge.
Talk about this a lot.
I know. I do. I'm a big talk about warm-up guy, right? It's just important that you're making everything dynamic for these sports because they take so much action. You need to be going through proper ranges of motion. You need to be increasing in the intensity towards the end as you go. So getting into those moderates and high intensities as you're at the end of the warm-up, because that's preparing you to be at top speed. That's preparing you to have rapid eccentric rate of force development. You need to prime the system to use it the way that you want to out on the field. So I think it's really important that you put the proper exercises in the appropriate order in your warm-up to start. And that's warm-up for game day, or that's warm-up for training session, or that's warm-up for a workout. Like everything should be appropriate, dynamic, sequential, progressive, all of that.
Right.
Moving down the list here, your practice intensities should match the game demands. Now, there is research out there about this too. Sorry for everyone. There was a ton of research that I pulled up on this, and I don't think that we would get through the podcast very quickly if I was just rambling off like what the titles are and reading almost every abstract here.
Yeah.
So I was very selective in that. But there is research out there that your practice intensities should match your game intensities or your game demands, right? And how that can show positive correlations for the longevity of that athlete's health, right? So you need to make sure that if you've got really tough games, or if you've got games that are going to require athletes to perform at a high level for a certain distance or a certain amount of time, you need to be able to progressively and appropriately plan that into your practices and build them up to that point, right? Where almost your practice should be harder than the game, right? So their bodies are ready to take on the demands that they might have in a competitive setting. I think it's pretty true to say players want to play in games, so they're probably more competitive and probably moving at higher velocities in the games than they would in practice, but you need them to run at the same intensities in practice,
right?
And kind of push that so they're able to handle whatever happens in the game. All right, next, talked about research. This one I'm going to bring a couple of articles in. So talking about single sessions of workouts during a week in season. Okay. Particularly, these two research articles are about soccer, one of the sports that we're covering today, and the energy systems that we're covering. Is it busy schedules, right? I know there's a lot of pushback from soccer on a lot of stuff, right? Just in my experience in American soccer teams.
Okay.
Of training during the season, right? Doing anything other than soccer and like foam rolling and stretching.
Interesting.
Right? There's a lot of pushback on, especially like lifting, which is crazy because EPL teams are lifting during season.
Yeah. And I didn't have that experience when I worked with soccer.
That's great. That's great. Women's soccer, a lot better than men's soccer.
It was just women's.
Yeah. Yeah. So men's soccer is typically giving you the most pushback.
Interesting.
For some reason. Women's soccer, for the most part, they're gung-ho about, staying healthy, being strong, makes sense, right? Anyways, so talking about single session workouts, to promote any type of fitness improvements throughout the competitive season. So does it work? Does it not work? Oh my gosh, I don't know.
Who knows?
So
it depends.
Yeah, it does. So actually, I'm only going to go over the abstracts here just because I want to save time and not like bore everyone with me reading a bunch of research while you're listening to a podcast. So I'm going to bring a couple of things into play here. Okay. First article I'm going to read was published in 2019. Okay. Second article that I'm going to read was published in 2020, year apart. All right. 2019 title is A Single Session of Straight Line and Change of Direction Sprinting per week does not lead to different fitness improvements in elite young soccer players. Okay. Does not lead to different fitness improvements.
Does not.
Okay. So the really quick abstract here. What's the population? 20 elite young soccer players. Goalkeepers not included in this. They were excluded. Okay. What's the time frame that we got here? 8-week period. Okay, they went through an 8-week period. They were randomly selected to go down this, right? So if you got selected to be in control, boom, you were in control. If you got selected to be sprint training, straight ahead sprint, you were over there. If you got picked for the change of direction, you were over there. Okay. So 10 players on both of them, both of the straight sprint, and then 10 players on the change of direction. Okay. The straight sprint was 3 sets of 7 of 30-meter sprints with 20 seconds. So 20 seconds to run 30 meters, right?
Okay.
And then 4-minute recovery between the sprints and between the sets. Okay. And then the change of direction was also 3 sets of 7, but it was 20 meters down, 20 meters back. Same time frames, 20-second sprints, and then 40-minute recovery between sprints and the sets. Okay.
40 or 4?
Sorry. I read something else there. 4-minute recovery.
Just clarifying.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good, very good clarification there. 4-minute recovery between sets and sprints. Physical tests that they looked at: long jump, repeat sprint ability best, repeat sprint ability mean, the 505 agility test, yo-yo recovery level 1, 10, 30, and 40-meter sprints. Okay, those are what they looked at. Basically, unclear variations in long jump, sprint 30 meters, sprint 40 meters, RSA best, RSA mean, and then the change of direction showed unclear and trivial variations in sprint 10-meter sprint and 30-meter sprint, 40-meter sprint, RSA best and mean. In conclusion, a single session of straight ahead sprints or change of direction does not improve soccer-specific fitness indicators in elite youth players during the season. If anybody's wondering about the schedule, they did go Monday through Friday with training. They played a match on Saturday. Sunday, they were off. Okay, they usually did their straight ahead or change of direction sprint training on the Wednesday after they played and did technical work.
Okay.
There is a note I want to make about the results here. The data analyzed found an improvement in sprint, a 10-meter sprint that was possible, but not significant. The 505 change of direction test, very likely, but not really significant. The yo-yo recovery level 1 was likely. Long jump was possible, but not likely. So, I mean, there are some things that were, it was unclear. They did show some improvements, but not enough for it to be significant. Right.
And it was also 8 weeks. So if there was a change, maybe if they had more time, maybe it could have become significant.
Right. Wow. Very, very good that you said that, Claire. That was my thought exactly. Okay. Going to the next research article here. Title of it: The Effect of a Single Session of Plyometric Training per Week on Fitness Parameters in Professional Female Soccer Players, a Randomized Control Trial. Okay, so first thing off here that we have, first one was elite young soccer players, males. Now we've got professional female soccer players, different population. Okay, obviously. You talked about the 8 weeks. This next one that we're talking about here, 12-week program.
Okay, so a little longer.
Oh, yeah. 16 players. Okay. 8 were doing a plyometric protocol and 8 were in a control group. Okay. Things that they tested: squat jump, counter movement jump, long jump, single leg, triple jump on dominant and non-dominant side, the 505 agility test that the other one did, a 10-meter and a 30-meter sprint. Okay. They were performed before and after the 12 weeks of plyometric training. Significant differences were found in the triple jump, dominant and non-dominant, and improvements in the 10-meter sprint. So the other one, unclear.
Right.
Unclear improvements in the 10-meter sprint. This one, significant improvement, right? So different on the, however, neither group reported significant variation in squat jump, counter movement jump, long jump, 505 change of direction, or the 30-meter sprint, right? These have strong practical applications that showed for the first time in a single session a week of plyometric, single session a week of plyometric training can significantly increase some parameters within the season, right?
Yeah.
So just really quickly on those comparison, right? Obviously, the first one showed no significant changes or improvements, and it was only 8 weeks. The second one was 12 weeks, and they showed improvement, right? Specifically, I want to say in the 10-meter sprint, right? Because that was one where it was unclear in the first, but significant in the second. So I wonder if, like you said, if that training had gone on for a little longer, would they start to see more of those positive correlations that became not just possible or likely, but became really like showing significance in the data. So it's out there where you can make improvements during the season. Being consistent, obviously, the 12-week being consistent for a long period of time definitely shows more of an improvement. So I think that still working on speed in season is important. I think working on your ability to change direction, or some type of fitness, maybe even if that's in a change of direction fashion, quote unquote, where you're sprinting down and sprinting back. Those qualities, like speed, have a tendency to diminish quickly. So I think it's important to still train them, right?
Right.
So obviously there's evidence that in-season training, even once a week, can be beneficial. It's just selecting the most appropriate. And there's still further research, I think, or I think we both agree that needs to be done with the sprinting one. If they did it longer, would it improve? So further research would be required there. However, all in summary, you should continue to train in season, whether that's speed, whether that's plyometrics, whether that's your ability to change directions. Those things are fundamental to the game, or to your ability to play the game at a high level.
Right.
You should still continue to work on those things.
Yeah.
Closing up with the last three here on my training considerations. Isometrics play a big role in a lot of strength parameters and a lot of fitness parameters that happen. So working on certain isometrics, like there's an article that I read leading up to it about the mid-thigh pull, isometric mid-thigh pull, if anyone knows out there what that is. But just that it has improvements in like force production, right? Which is huge.
Right.
I mean, your force production capabilities play into your sprinting ability. So if you have the ability to produce force for a certain time at specific knee angles, which is what they're doing in this mid-thigh pull, those knee angles are going to be more related to top end speed. So you want to have those types of capabilities at those knee angles. So isometrics are great to use during the season, right? They can also help with tendonitis of like jumper's knee in basketball, but I know we're not talking about that, but carries over, right?
Cool.
Sled pulls. There's an article that I read about heavy sled pulls for female Australian rules football or Aussie football. That showed improvements in their sprint ability at 10 and I think 30 meters. So sled pulls would be great if you've got that capability, whether it's sled or whether it's like chain pulls, if you've got the type of belt to hold it up. So some type of weighted resisted running. I should say resisted
Could you even
running.
do like banded with a person behind you?
Research didn't say that, but I'm sure like there are some. It probably has to do with the resistance and the angle of which you're applying force to the ground and accelerating, right? So I think there's merit to that. I just can't say that it's out there in research, right? And then the last one, you should do multi-directional movements because your sports happen in 3D. They don't happen, forward and backward the whole time. They don't happen side to side the whole time. And when you kick the ball, when you throw the ball with a stick, or when you go to pass the ball in rugby, that's a 3D movement, right? And your body is moving in all these different planes. So you need to be able to move multi-directional through strength, through plyometrics, through running, all of those things. So those are my training considerations. Last thing I want to cover is just testing, because we talked about a little bit of research and we talked about training. I think it's important to test, or if you want to call it assessing, you need to do an initial assessment and you need to assess somewhere else down the line. And we talked about endurance athletes there. I gave the 3-level test that you could do during your training, right? It may not always be the case for intermittent sports where you can just do these fitness assessments all the time, right? You may be able to monitor in different ways, but assessments probably is a little bit more challenging. However, you could do certain assessments like counter movement jumps, vertical jumps, or broad jumps, just to get force characteristics or their capabilities, and you could monitor those things. You could assess sprints. You could do a 10-meter sprint, 10-yard sprint. You could time those regularly, weekly if you wanted to, as a part of your speed training sessions. When you get to the middle of it or after a really great dynamic warm up, you could assess those as a monitoring system of, hey, we're getting slower overall. They need to be done, not hand timed. And they should be done consistently and be done the same way every single time if you want those answers or those results to be valid, reliable. So you could do those, right? I just mentioned that the fitness assessments, you should do those preseason, definitely. I think leading up to it. You could do the yo-yo, beep. For rugby, there's something called the Wales anaerobic test that I was introduced to yesterday via research article, which is awesome because it's a rugby specific type of yo-yo test. It's great for them. I know soccer has moved into sometimes doing the 30-15 intermittent fitness test, which I think is great. I like that one probably a little bit more than the beep or the yo-yo. And then also, who knows, you might be able to do that 3-level test that I talked about.
Yeah.
You may not need to do it for a whole minute, but you could still take that assessment later on. I don't think you should do the 1 mile. I don't think you should run 3 miles or a 5K. And I'm not really sold on the Man U. I don't think that's not even like a yo-yo test. And sometimes I think that it got booked together, but I don't know. Like, did some of my soccer teams do that? Yeah, they did at Florida Southern, but I'm not sold on it. Yeah. So I think for strength testing purpose, you could also just another additive here. You could test strength as well, mostly lower body. I think it's not necessarily appropriate to test upper body unless you're in a contact sport where you're actually trying to move people with your upper body,
right?
Like rugby would be.
Yeah.
Lower body is probably the most important thing. Really putting the importance on the concentric and eccentric strength. So there are those things to look at there. I think that's all my points.
Okay. Cool. Well, that was a lot of information, a lot of training considerations to take into account for these sports.
Yeah, I think it's a simple thing to do, but there are a lot of things to consider.
Yeah.
There are more things to consider than I talked about too. So
I'm sure there are.
Yeah, there really are. So those were the things I needed to touch on, high importance, in my opinion. So yeah, there's all the training considerations, but we want to hear all about the nutritional side as well, because any of that recovery stuff is important for us to know, like, how do we fuel our body for these sports in particular. It's different than what we talked about last week. So
yeah, it is very, I wouldn't say it's very different, but it is different. It's not different in the sense of like the energy needs are still pretty high with these sports, particularly because like you mentioned before, you're kind of moving through utilizing aerobic and anaerobic, those two energy systems as your like primary energy systems at different points throughout a game or throughout a practice, depending on what you're doing. However, as similar to endurance sports, as the intensity increases, we're mainly relying on that aerobic system. So again, when we think about from a nutrition perspective, what that means we're mainly relying on our glycogen stores, aka carbs. So, typically in those, maybe let's say like a really high intensity practice or in a game, we're really going to be relying on carbohydrates as our main source of energy. They can benefit our nervous system, your energy levels, increase your performance. So all of those things that are obviously very important as an athlete, and particularly during a game. So similar to maybe what we said last time or last week when we talked about endurance sports, that being a little different because we're going for a prolonged period of time, maybe in more like a half marathon sense, where we're depleting those glycogen stores over time. So we need to replenish those as we go. Same thing with these types of sports, but because they're going at such a high intensity, even if it's not for such a long period of time, we still need to at some point replenish those stores and replenish those carbohydrates. So halftime is a good time to work on those things. And we worked a lot on that in collegiate sports because sometimes, when you think about it, maybe they're not hungry, maybe they're nervous, maybe they're tired, whatever it might be. It's just like, oh no, I'm not hungry. But hunger is not the best, indicator of when we need to eat and what we need. So that was a big thing that, we worked on then. And that's a really huge window of opportunity to be able to, maybe get an edge over your competition or just really put yourself in a better spot to be able to perform at a higher level and be able to execute some of these things, like making really fast decisions about change of direction or where they need to go and things like that. So because carbohydrates are so important, general recommendations for those are about 7 grams per kilogram per day for the intermittent power athlete. Obviously, those can vary because everything depends, it depends on maybe what their position is, how long they've been in the game, what their practice looked like. Do they have maybe they're in a tournament? Do they have another game the next day? So it just kind of depends. So we can vary somewhere between like 7 to 12 grams per kilogram per day.
Yeah, that's a good point you made, because a lot of the research that I've seen about soccer in general is that midfielders cover more distance than any other position on the soccer field. So they would be more towards that 12 grams per kilogram.
Probably maybe 10 to 12.
Yeah. Okay.
Somewhere around there. So similar to what we talked about last week with endurance athletes, it's going to vary somewhere between 5 to 7 to 10 to 12, depending on the intensity and the amount of time that they're, in this energy system. Protein needs. So the protein needs of an intermittent power athlete is going to be higher than an endurance athlete. So general recommendations are 1.4 to 1.7 grams per kilogram. But again, it could be higher depending on the season. Maybe preseason, it needs to be a little bit higher just because of the intensity of the workouts. We need a little bit more for recovery. Off season, it might be higher too, because maybe we're really focusing on hypertrophy and building strength versus in season where, we're focusing more on some of those sport specific things and training. But again, just depends on the time of the season, but that's the general kind of recommendation. One of the probably most important nutrition consideration is hydration. Particularly again, because when you look at sports like soccer or rugby or lacrosse, you could be on the field the entire game depending on who you are. So, I mean, hydration is important in endurance and these, but then when you look at, and we haven't touched on power sports yet, but when you look at that, we're getting more like kind of bursts of things. We have more opportunity to hydrate and refuel.
Right.
So hydration is really important. And then when you look at sports where you're adding additional gear, again, when you're running, you have your tank top and your shorts and your shoes, and that's about it if it's hot. But if you play lacrosse, you can't not wear your pads and your helmet.
Yeah.
Like that's your gear, that's your uniform. Same thing with, I know we didn't mention ice hockey, but I kind of have some stuff in there. They can be considered an intermittent power sport / power sport, kind of depending on what's going on. But again, a lot of gear, right? And so that's going to alter their sweat rate. That's going to alter the amount of and the hydration strategies that they need to be implementing during their game or their practices. So just some general considerations. Work on really maximizing your water and your hydration intake throughout the day. That may seem very obvious, but a lot of the times it's not happening because maybe we don't have a water bottle with us. We don't carry a reusable water bottle. Maybe we just forget. So maybe setting an alarm or setting reminders or whatever as an athlete could be really helpful. Even if you're in class, maybe every 20 minutes, like we have a vibrating alarm that goes off that, hey, you need to drink like 20 ounces of water or whatever it might be.
One of my high school coaches had a good suggestion and maybe a little bit of a rule of thumb for us. Anytime you pass a water fountain, you should take a drink.
Yeah, I think that's a great rule of thumb. Yeah. Because a lot of the times hydration is something that goes under the radar. Consuming fluids regularly throughout practice. I was guilty of this as an athlete. Anytime I drank anything as a swimmer or a runner, I immediately got a cramp, like a side stitch cramp. So I didn't drink really at all during any practices. I would make sure that I was rehydrating after. But if you can, and part of that is, I didn't know this then, but part of that is like training your gut. You have to train your body to be able to tolerate that and withstand it. So maybe if it's just a little sip every 20 minutes or here and there, whenever you get a break, trying to train your body to be able to tolerate that. So throughout your practices and your games, you can make sure you're rehydrating. So we're not getting to a point where our performance is suffering. And then rehydrating after practices and games with water, electrolytes, and carbohydrates. From an electrolyte standpoint, specifically sodium and chloride, but specifically sodium because it helps to sustain your thirst drive. It makes sure that you're restoring your plasma volume, and it helps retain ingested fluids. I couldn't find, I looked for this, but I remember in undergrad when I first started my dietetics degree, we had talked about hydration, and I think it was probably in a nutrition and sports class, but I remember this image of I think it was a sodium ion, and it had a water droplet on a leash, and it was pulling it. And I think it was a good representation of where sodium is. There's water retention, right? That water stays where that sodium is. So I think that's a good analogy for athletes to think of when you have that sodium and you're drinking that water. That's helpful to make sure that you're rehydrating what you just dehydrated. Right. And then carbohydrates, obviously, because we want to replenish our glycogen stores, we just used all that carbohydrate to make energy. But also from a hydration perspective, that glycogen also stores water. So for every gram of glycogen, we're storing 3 grams or so of water, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. But from a loss perspective, for each liter of sweat lost, why we want to try and avoid going an entire practice or going an entire game without replenishing that is because your heart rate is going to increase could be up to 8 beats per minute for every liter of sweat loss, and your cardiac output is going to decrease. So both of those things are problematic for athletes.
Not good.
Don't want those things. So those are the general recommendations. I do have a couple examples and studies from some of these intermittent power sports of just to basically just look at what are they doing nutritionally? Do they match up to some of these recommendations? Do they not? And gave some practical, I think, applications of what we as nutrition professionals can be doing better, and what these athletes can do a little bit better, or kind of just the margin that they have to become better athletes because of what they're not doing nutritionally. So one study here is with Division II female lacrosse players. So they recorded their dietary intake for 4 consecutive days, 5 times throughout the entire year. So not just in season, but they did preseason, in season, and out of season. They looked at their TDE, so their total daily energy expenditure, and their activity energy expenditure. And it was found to change significantly over the course of the season, which that makes sense. And during preseason, it was the highest. Again, that makes sense.
Yep.
So they found that their total daily energy expenditure was somewhere around 2,800 calories, and their activity energy expenditure, so what they were expending during their training, was about 1,000 calories. But looking through their food logs, their caloric, carbohydrate, and protein intake did not change throughout the year. So it stayed the same throughout that preseason, in-season, and postseason, which, again, makes sense for an athlete just kind of going about their day and time, and they're like, this is what I eat, this is what I feel hungry for, without really kind of that consideration of the time of the year, what they're doing.
Right.
But they found that the average caloric intake was about 2,150 calories. Carbohydrate intake was about 3.6 grams per kilogram. So you'll remember that the average recommendation was about 7, what we just mentioned.
Wow.
And then protein intake was about 1.2 gram per kilogram. So again, it's not so much off from that 1.4 to 1.7, but it's still not where it needs to be.
Well, it's not great if it didn't change, where you mentioned at least a couple times in our podcast that your diet or your nutritional needs, they should change as you go through different seasons, right? It should be higher at some points in time, right?
Yeah, it should be higher, and maybe the composition of your macronutrients should change, again, depending on your goals. Maybe in season and out of season might not look that much different. Again, if we're just trying to kind of maintain weight, muscle mass, body composition, all of those things. But particularly in season and everything else, or preseason and everything else, should look different. It should look different. But every single one of these athletes self-reported moderate negative energy balance and low energy availability, which from looking at the data, that's pretty obvious. So the main conclusion, or the main point of talking about this and drawing this out, is that they're not eating enough.
Yeah.
not just for preseason, but just in general. So again, that's going to compound throughout the entire year. We're going to be more susceptible to injuries. Maybe we're not really even seeing any of the benefits from what we're doing in the weight room because your body can't even, do all these processes it needs to do to just be in energy balance. So
Wow.
I thought that was interesting. A second study, this is in ice hockey again. So I mentioned ice hockey before, but looking at Major Junior League, American Hockey League, and National Hockey League. Again, I mentioned hockey players wear a significant amount of gear. I think that's pretty obvious. So again, it can become problematic as sweat rate increases and hydration strategies are not changed. So there's been previous research that has reported in elite junior hockey players an average loss of 1.4 to 1.8 liter per hour of sweat, and in professional players, an average of 1.3 to 2.5, not 25, liters per hour of sweat during practices. So it's a decent amount. Basically, they did a bunch of testing pre-practice, hydration measures, post-practice, body weight changes, and all of that. So at the end, throughout all of their measurements, they found that 15% of the junior, 41% of American Hockey League, and 48% of National Hockey League reached or were close to mild dehydration. So at that point, they're at an increased risk of performance decrements in a 90-minute practice. So essentially, they found that they were 2 to 3% dehydrated after practice, which again puts them at an increased risk for a lot of performance decrements, again, like decision making, muscle cramping. So all of these things that can be prevented from fueling strategies and hydration strategies, they were not doing. And 41 and 48% is half the team, basically.
Yeah, it's huge.
Almost half the team. That's a lot.
Yeah.
So anyway, again, something just to show the importance of that. And then the last one was pretty straightforward, pretty short. But again, this one was in soccer. Looking at the average energy expenditure measured, it was about 27 to 2,800 calories a day in elite females and 35 to 3,600 calories in elite males. They found that the average soccer player was at about 75 to 80% of that in their actual intake. So again, if we looked at like the lacrosse players and soccer players, similar maybe type of sport when you look at it simplistically, their energy needs are going to be about the same. But if we look at the average, we're typically about 700, maybe 600 calories under what we need to be eating, which is a lot. That's like one whole meal.
Wow.
And then they also found that most players do not drink sufficiently during matches to optimize hydration, replacing only 40 to 45% of sweat losses.
Wow. That's a staggering amount.
That is a staggering amount.
Especially when you talked about several times throughout the time I've known you about how dehydration really just impairs your performance.
Yeah, just even like mild dehydration, like in this hockey, mild dehydration can affect a lot of things. When you think, I mean, your body is primarily made up of water.
Right.
So if you're not replacing that and you're getting rid of a lot of it all at once, there's going to be a lot of problems. And if you're used to being mildly dehydrated, you might not even notice. So again, there's this kind of like gap of, this is where I'm used to operating. But if we could just like maximize what you're doing with this one thing of just drinking more water and electrolytes, you could be, how much better could you be? I don't know. It could be like 50%, maybe not that much, but.
Well, seriously, but is that the percent you need? Is that the small percent change that you might need to help you be better than this person at a showcase or a tournament where you're getting looked at by college coaches and you have an opportunity to perform at a high level, but you're not because you're not drinking enough water, you're not hydrated?
It could be. Yeah. I mean, when you think again from just even from like a cognitive perspective, it could be between the decision of cutting right or cutting left. And one
could be the
wrong decision.
Yeah. You're a millisecond behind, right? Because you're dehydrated and you couldn't make that change quick enough. That's crazy.
Yeah. So just some things to highlight it. I mean, I'm sure I probably harp on this a lot, but the nutrition piece is so important because of all of those, small little changes that can make a big impact and really affect what they're doing in this case, on the field and in the weight room.
Right. You touched on different competitive seasons of the year, and I failed to mention this earlier, but I wanted to touch back on preseason, the importance of preseason training. Another article that I came across as I was preparing for this podcast was the importance of preseason training as it related to soccer players. And the study had a 12-week preseason, which is
That's long.
I know it's so rare, but it wasn't like a collegiate setting or anything like that.
That's usually like 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, it's weeks, right? So even to highlight that even further, the importance of things is their injury rate was significantly lower. I mean, I want to say it was like less than 10%, and those weren't of high severity because of the emphasis they put on their preseason training, right? So I wanted to emphasize that for our listeners out there is that you may not have a 12-week preseason, but that probably falls into the off season, or if you're a collegiate player, that probably falls into your summertime, maybe. The importance of preparing yourself as you're leading up to your preseason is just as important as that preseason time as well, because you have prepared your body to take on those demands, and you're a little more resilient to the forces that you're facing, and therefore you should be more robust to any adverse situation physically that you might be in, and a little more resilient to injury. So the preseason and preparing yourself leading up to preseason and the season is of high importance. So please take that seriously, just as you would take everything that Claire said seriously, because it can affect your performance.
Yeah.
I mean, legit.
Yeah. And off season is a good time nutritionally for athletes to focus on putting an emphasis on that, because sometimes, during season there's school and there's this and that. And if they're multi-sport athletes, there's 2 practices, and sometimes nutrition falls to the wayside, which we don't want to happen. But sometimes we really need that off-season time to like get in a routine and really focus on it and say, okay, this is what works for me. This is how I can get all of these calories in a day. And we need to really establish that to then carry that into, our other competitive seasons and training seasons.
Yeah, really establish your habits there so you can set yourself up for success later on when things get a little more competitive and important.
Yeah.
Last thing we're going to close with here, we just want to touch on our services a little bit. I know we've been talking about training considerations for specific sports in the last couple podcasts, and we will continue to do that next podcast talking about power sports. But we've given a lot of general guidance and considerations here, but aside from this podcast and this general guidance that we give here, we also do individual one-to-one coaching with athletes. So whether you're involved with a club that has College Fit Finder, an Aces Nation product, or you're not involved with Aces Nation at all and you're listening to this podcast, your athlete is able to work with us one-to-one to get a specific nutrition plan that would talk about fueling for breakfast, talk about, how to fit in the right amount of nutrition in your busy schedule as you're traveling from school to maybe your club team's practice, or you're coming home from that practice and you need to fit in some more calories or some more protein or something to fit in these recommendations that Claire's giving based on the sport that you play, so your energy needs are met through your diet. So and then also I provide anything that's specific to strength conditioning that might help for your sport, that may apply to that rate of force development that I was talking about, or anything that would be a conditioning benefit for you to fit the energy system of the sport that you play. So we also do that one-to-one coaching. Claire, do you want to say anything about our one-to-one there?
Yeah, I just think it's a really unique opportunity for younger athletes. Most of the time they don't get this opportunity because we're working together. So we're coordinating, a structured plan and programming together, so they complement each other based on the sport, based on the season, based on just each person's individual needs. And that's really important, because we could give general guidelines all day long, and that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to work for everybody. That's why I say it depends so dang much. But yeah, I think it's a really unique opportunity. So, I would jump on it if I had the opportunity as an athlete.
Absolutely. And Claire and I both did not have this type of resource when we were younger.
Mm-mm.
I mean, I
Not
had
until
to
college.
just fight and claw for everything for myself when I was in high school and middle school without a ton of guidance, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's a great resource to have at a younger population and really talk about establishing good habits and good behaviors, movement patterns early on, and really developing something that will help you be more marketable as a player, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through improvements in sport, and can really carry on to your lifestyle as well to help you have an understanding of what it means to fuel yourself properly, what it
Mm-hmm.
means to take care of your body for your health. So not only from a sport perspective, but also developing those habits for everyday life and future life as well. So we're going to put a link to a web form in our description, so you'll be able to click on it wherever you're listening to this podcast, or if you're watching it on YouTube for our viewers out there who like to watch us interact in person, see how we move around. And you can also reach out to us via our email. Mine is zwallace@acesnation.org.
And mine's CIGOE@acesnation.org.
Yeah. So just our first letter and then our last name at that. So we will catch you on the next one.
See you next time.